So welcome everyone from North Plains Public Library. We're really excited today to partner with Starkey's Corner and have a special Houseplant Appreciation 101. Okay, and my colleague Steve is going to be picking it from here.
Hi, my name is Steve. I'm from North Plains Public Library, and I just want to welcome everybody on National Houseplant Appreciation Day. Today, we are going to have a presentation from Michaela Trevithick from Starkey's Corner Farm and Garden Store in North Plains, correct? It's North Plains?
Technically, we're Hillsborough, but yeah.
Technically, Hillsborough on Glencoe Road and Scotch Church. Yes. Anyway, she's going to be talking today with us today about caring for houseplants. Introduction to that. And Michaela, take it away.
Good morning.
Hi, everybody. I am first going to ask that everybody mute themselves if they can. And I just want to kind of give you a little few things here before I start. If you have questions, we are going to do a Q&A after each section. So put your questions in the chat and we will go back to them at the end of each section. I'll try my best to answer any questions that you guys have. And then Steve also had put a little section in the chat as well that we are going to be recording. And if you don't want to be recorded, please turn your video and your microphone off.
Yes, I neglected to mention that we are recording today, and so if you do not want to be seen or heard, please make note of that. You can get your questions in the chat section. Thanks, Michaela.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, I am just going to get started. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys about houseplants because this is probably my favorite part of my job is taking care of the houseplants. I have multiple houseplants at home. It's a big deal to me to kind of bring nature inside. And I wanted to tell you guys the benefits of having houseplants, and there's a couple of them that I think are really, really important. So I'm just gonna start off right off the bat here and get going with those. So one of the biggest things that most people have houseplants for is because they're really great air purifiers. Just like the trees are outside and the plants that we have in our yards, houseplants can really help purify the air inside your house. And what not a lot of people know is that the inside of your house can have a lot of toxins in it. So the benefit to having some houseplants in there is that while they are photosynthesizing and growing, they are taking in carbon dioxide and other what's called VOCs, which are, let me see, I've got my notes here, volatile substances in the air in your house. They're taking all of that in, and then they are putting out oxygen, which is going to help with the air quality in your house. So that one is a really big one. I have a few studies that I want to share with you after I go through this list about why it's important. Number two, houseplants can help improve your mood. So having a couple houseplants here and there, especially if they're really bright in color or really nice green, those can help improve your mood because of the natural aesthetic. I don't know if any of you guys have noticed, but when you're out walking in nature or you're out hiking and you really start to feel a little bit more calm and a little bit at peace, reduced anxiety, that's because of the plants that are around you. So bringing those into your house is super helpful in improving your mood and helping with lowering stress and anxiety. Another good one, which not necessarily super important here, but in multiple parts of the world, having a little bit of extra humidity in your house is beneficial, and having houseplants are super important in that, so that you don't necessarily have to have a humidifier running all the time or have to have other stuff going on. So having houseplants, because they are photosynthesizing and taking in energy, releasing energy, they also transpire, kind of like how we sweat. So they have little pores in their leaves, and as they're going through photosynthesis, they will release moisture into the air, helping with the humidity in your house, which is kind of cool. And then the last part that I want to talk about, as far as the benefits go, is having houseplants can be very therapeutic, going through the process of taking care of them, watering them, giving them food, making sure that you can have them in the proper space is a nice process to go through, so you can slow down and really like quiet your mind a little bit while you're doing that kind of stuff. So that's one of the main reasons that I have houseplants in my house, because when I go through the process of repotting them or taking care of them or figuring out what's going on, it's really nice to just kind of have that quiet moment to go through, and I do that about once a week, which is really beneficial to my mental health. So I had mentioned a few minutes ago when I was talking about air purifiers, that I had a few studies that I wanted to talk about, and one of them was a NASA study from 1989, and they had taken houseplants and put them in a controlled environment, like a cube, and they pumped gas, toxic gases into those cubes, and then recorded how long that it took for those plants to purify the air in those containers. And they found a few really good ones because they were considering having plants on the International Space Station. So it was really fun to look at and see that they were just considering using houseplants as a purification system on top of their purification system that they have installed in the International Space Station. So what they concluded with that study for people in homes is that having at least 2 large houseplants per 100 square feet is beneficial for the air quality of your home. The one thing that makes a huge difference between the study from NASA and having houseplants in your home is that NASA had an extremely controlled environment, and homes are not necessarily extremely controlled, so it'll be a little bit different. So you can take that as you want with how well it works, how many plants per square footage. But I think it's really cool that they did that study, especially for the International Space Station. And then talking about the therapeutic benefits and the mood improvement benefits, I have a couple of studies from the Kansas State University where they took a set of patients and put plants in their hospital rooms, and then had a separate set of patients and they did not have plants in their hospital rooms. And they found that the hospital rooms that had plants in them had patients with a sped up recovery rate, which I think is really cool. Being surrounded by nature and having those calming effects can affect your body systems. So that was a fun study that I wanted to share with you guys. And then there was another study, real quick, by the Dutch Product Board for Horticulture. And they did a workplace study. And this one is really fun for me because obviously I work with a whole bunch of plants. But they did a study where they put plants in office buildings, and adding plants decreased the workers' fatigue, any symptoms of colds and headaches throughout the amount of time that they had plants in the office space, which I thought was also really cool. So like if you work in a cubicle or something like that, having a little plant on your desk can be beneficial. So I thought that was just pretty cool, and I wanted to share that with you guys. And then I don't think many people are going to have questions about that first section, so I'm going to move into the second one because I didn't see any pop up in the chat. But as a reminder, I'm doing a few different sections, so if you want to ask your questions in the chat while I'm talking, and I'll get to them at the end of each section, I am going to try my best to answer all of your questions. make sure that I didn't see anything else pop up. Yeah, okay. So now I want to talk about, because one of the biggest things that people ask about is plant care. That's the biggest thing that we get questions about when people come in. And it's going to depend on your space, first and foremost, because everybody's home is very individual. But there are a few main things that you can focus on so that you have a good base starting out with your plants. One of the biggest things is figuring out the lighting situation in your house. So whether you live in an apartment or you live in a house or you live in a camper, it's like, I did that for a while. My plants did not like it as much in my camper as they did in my house. So there's just a few things to consider when you're looking at your area and what houseplants you want to buy, because that'll definitely determine what you can have and what you probably should avoid. So a few things to consider would be the light that you get. So most plants like moderate to bright light, which is going to be closer to windows, not in direct sunlight, so they don't want to be like direct sun shining on them, but most south and west facing windows are going to be really good options for plants. So if you live on the east side of an apartment building, or all of your windows in your house are on the east side of your house, you're going to want to choose plants that are better for lower light situations. There is also going to be a benefit to having warmer spots in your house versus having cool, drafty spots. You want to avoid the cool, drafty spots because plants do not like having that little change in temperature every once in a while, unless they're an extremely hardy plant, which some of them are. So you want to just pay attention to which plants you're choosing and which ones you want to use. And I'll kind of talk about plants in the next section so that you can get an idea of which ones are good for each of these spaces. Another one to pay attention to is dry air versus humid air. So if you have a really dry space, you're going to want to have plants that can thrive in that drier environment. So depending on where you live, like if you live in the desert, you're going to want to have plants that can handle that dry air. Here we don't have to worry about it as much because we have that higher humidity, but then you also can have spaces in your house that are more humid than others. Like the bathroom is definitely a more humid space than, say, like your living room. Your kitchen might even be a little bit more humid if you're cooking in it. So those little things determine a lot about where you put your houseplants and what houseplants you can buy or should buy. And then I think I have one or two more things that I wanted to talk about with that. Even with some of the low light plants, because they can survive in low light doesn't mean they'll necessarily thrive. So they're going to grow a lot slower if you have low light areas. Like if you were to put a plant in a bathroom with only one window, that plant is probably going to grow a lot slower than it would if you put a plant in a west or south facing window where it gets really bright indirect light, and it can be the exact same plant, but they'll have two different growth rates because of the environment that they're in. And I'll go over that with some of the plants that I show you in the next section. The other thing that is super important to consider when you're putting your plants together and figuring out what you want to get is the pots that you have available and the soil that you're using, because you want to imitate the soil that they naturally grow in, which is very different if you're growing a succulent versus a big leafy tropical plant. So one thing that I actually like to do is mix soils. So I have like cactus mix and I have regular potting soil, and sometimes I mix those together depending on what I'm potting, because I want really good drainage and to emulate the soil for a tropical plant. So that is super important when you're looking at the plants that you want to buy. Like if you wanted to buy a aloe plant, they don't like being wet, so you want to make sure that you buy a pot that has big holes, not necessarily big holes in the bottom, but good drainage so that it doesn't hold on to water. And if you were to put the aloe in a pot that doesn't have holes in it, you're going to water it less. So the water needs of a plant also is dependent on the pots that you put it in, as well as the environment. I hope that's kind of making sense. I'm trying not to jump all over the place too much, but I keep thinking of things as I say things. The biggest question that we get about plant care is, how often do I water it? And that is also completely determined by the environment that it's in. So like here at work, we water probably once a week, but that's because we have higher temperature set to keep the plants warm, because the doors are open and closed all day. And then we also have like a ceiling fan, things like that. So when you're putting your plant in a room, to consider the surrounding environment as well as the pot that it's in. Like if you have something in terracotta, you're probably going to water it a little bit more often than you would a glazed pot, because terracotta is a porous material, so it breathes. Some plants, those are really good for. Like I keep all of my succulents and all of my more desert plants in terracotta so that I can control the water a lot better. And then another thing that that I'm thinking of with the pots, if you're using a pot that doesn't have drainage, putting a little bit of gravel or something in the bottom to give water some space, just in case you do overfill it a little bit, can help in some situations. Once the plant gets big enough and the roots are down in there, then it's probably time to repot it into a new pot so that the roots aren't sitting in that water if you do put little gravel bits in the bottom. I think that about covers for right now, unless there's questions. Plant care. Steve, has there been some questions in the chat? I can look too to see.
Are there supplemental lighting products that could help a plant survive even in a windowless room?
Yes.
If you have recommendations, I'd love to hear. Thanks.
I would use, some plants can survive on fluorescent light, which is really cool. There are very few for the fluorescent light, but then you can also get grow lights, which we even keep a few in our back rooms here because we don't have enough light in those rooms. And grow lights come in multiple different varieties and stages. So it depends on the plant, but it might take a little bit of research. I don't use grow lights at home. I just don't put stuff in rooms where I can't fully keep an eye on them, especially with their light needs. But grow lights are really beneficial, and you can get freestanding ones that just have a single bulb. You can also get like systems where you hang them if you have like ceiling bar lights, which is very beneficial, especially if you're like growing seeds and stuff like that inside, which kind of starts in February as well. I know that's a whole like big different topic, but grow lights are really beneficial for rooms that don't have enough light and you still want to put some plants that do need more light. And then it's just a matter of controlling when those lights are on and off. Generally 12 hours on, 12 hours off is really good for using a grow light system. I hope that answers that question.
How about Michaela, for orchids? What are the watering needs for orchid?
Orchids like to be in a more humid environment. If you think about where orchids originate, it's most of the time really damp, rainforest environment, or really dense forested environment. So they like to have that little bit of humidity because they're a what's the right word? They grow in the lower levels of a forest, not in the canopy, not in the middle. They grow in the lower level. So I normally, I don't currently have any orchids, but when I did have orchids, I watered them with an ice cube so that it was a slow melt, setting it on top of the moss next to the roots. Keeping them in a humid room is also really beneficial. You don't necessarily have to mist them or anything, but they do like having that little bit more humidity. And then obviously it depends on your space, but if you have a drier space, you're going to want to water them a little bit more often.
Can you speak to pruning when leaves have gone south?
Yes, I have an example. So like this Dieffenbachia has a yellow leaf on the bottom. And normally,
orchids to rebloom.
Ooh, to get them to rebloom. I don't have a whole lot of knowledge on getting orchids to rebloom. That would be, sometimes it can be a fertilizer situation with blooming. But normally with orchids, if they are shriveling, I will just prune those sections off. And then orchids do go through a phase where the stem part will die back, and you can cut that off and leave the bottom with the leaves. And those will eventually grow new shoots to reflower. They are a little slower growing if they're not in ideal conditions. So sometimes it can take a while. So my recommendation on that is just to be a little bit patient. And then while we're talking about that really quick, just with pruning, so like with these guys, if they're big leafy green ones, I normally let the leaves go all the way yellow, if not almost to brown, because that's going through the natural cycle of the plant. The plant is using up all the nutrients in that leaf that it's losing before it gets rid of it. Because most of the time, if you let that yellow leaf go, it'll just turn brown and fall off. And that's a sign that the plant has used all of the nutrients in that leaf. You don't have to let it do that, but it's not going to hurt it to leave that leaf on there. So.
Okay. Is that the same for leaves that turn brown at the tips rather than yellow?
Brown at the tips might be something that is more of a water situation than a leaf that's going through its natural process. So I would check that they are either not being overwatered or underwatered.
Okay.
And the big thing with the water needs, it's definitely going to take some time, especially with a brand new plant, to get used to the water needs of that plant, because every plant is going to be different. The size makes a difference. The pot that it's in makes a difference. So my normal like gauge for checking if a plant needs water or not is like right when you get the plant and you put it in its new pot, test how heavy it is dry, like just lift it up and then water it in and everything after you repotted it. Or if you stick your finger in the dirt up to like your first or second knuckle and it still feels wet, it doesn't necessarily need water. So if that's a good kind of rule of thumb for when you're looking at your plants and trying to gauge whether or not they need water, that's at least what I use at home, and it works relatively well.
Okay. We have any other questions at the moment?
Based on houseplant care.
Yes, you may unmute yourself for a question. You don't have to use the chat.
I have a question, but it's about succulents that are outside in the summer. Can you leave them outside as the temperature changes, or do you need to bring them in?
It depends on the succulent. There are two different categories for succulents. One is hardy for zones that you are in. So here for us in Oregon, at least in the like Portland area, Hillsborough area, we're at 8B zone. Most of the time, 8B, yep.
Okay.
Most of the time you can find on the plant tags what zone they are hardy for. Most ornamental succulents, like this guy, are not hardy. So they do need to come inside once the temperature starts dropping. And they also don't like the amount of water that we get in the winter time. So if you are leaving some of the succulents outside, they would need to be in a pot and like up against your building versus out in your garden or on your patio.
Michaela, I've heard it's best to let water sit for a day before using it to water. Is that true?
It depends on your water. I know that this is a lot of like specifics it depends on. A lot of people like to use filtered distilled water. Then you don't have to wait at all. I use water right out of my tap and I don't wait, but it also does depend on your water because like the water here at Starkey is very mineralized and the plants do not like it. They absolutely hate the water because it has too much minerals, too much salt. So we use a filtered water here. So it could completely depend, like if you have a water filtration system, most houses have some built in to their water piping, but if you're not seeing that, and if you're seeing like residue, I don't know if I have an example, residue on like the saucers under your pots, then maybe use a distilled water or a filtered water for your plants.
Okay. Any more questions right now? Do you recommend watering by using ice cubes? I think you said so, yes?
Only with orchids. Orchids are really picky with their water, so that's the only one that I've ever used ice cubes with. Yeah, everything else is pretty much like I bring my watering can around and just water it as it's required by the specific plant. Oh, and I do want to mention one more thing while we're still in the plant care. Houseplants, because they are in a pot, go through their nutrients really, really fast. So most houseplants actually like a weekly or every other week fertilizing. And you can use a liquid fertilizer on houseplants so that there's not so much, especially if you're using an organic fertilizer, sometimes they have a smell to them. So if you're using a liquid fertilizer, it's not as pungent of a smell. I use liquid fertilizer, and when you're looking at the breakdown of the nutrients, the NPK, it's a 2-2-2. So it's a very light fertilization. Because you're doing it weekly or every other week, depending on how often your plants are getting watered. And that will help keep them nice and green. It will help keep new growth going. It will help with the flowering if you have like an African violet or something. We normally carry specific fertilizers, like for African violets. We have cactus fertilizer. We have regular, just like greenhouse plant fertilizer. And the NPK number changes a little bit for each of those, but they do like to have at least a couple times a month of fertilization, especially if you're not seeing a lot of growth happening and you're not fertilizing your plants.
Do you recommend repotting plants out of their plastic pots like pretty soon after you buy? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
Most pots that you're getting from garden centers and nurseries are already growing out of those pots. I think I have an example here like this guy. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little root right here. And then there's roots coming out the bottom. So they are already ready to be potted up. And I would go at least a couple inches bigger on the pot, both directions, tall and wide. Minimum when you're up potting something, because they have been in those pots for so long. And you don't have to be afraid of like messing up the roots when you repot stuff. Like definitely give them a good little tossle, because that lets them know that they're getting repotted and going into new soil and can branch out instead of growing in that same circular shape that they're in the nursery pots. And each plant has kind of its own needs too. So like some plants do like having their roots close together and being a little bit more root bound. Some plants do not like being root bound at all.
Okay.
Okay.
How can you tell when a houseplant needs to be repotted without the roots popping through the top of the soil?
One good sign is that you're having to water it really often because it's using up the water so fast. Another sign is that it's not putting on any new growth.
Okay.
And that's like, if it looks like it's full in there and it's got a bunch of leaves and stuff, but you haven't seen anything new in a while, it's probably because it's needing a bigger pot space.
Okay.
Michaela, I have another question. I have a freshwater aquarium and was recently told I should use the aquarium water for houseplants when I do water changes. Is this an idea you're familiar with? Anything to be careful with if I try?
It is an idea I'm familiar with. It's actually very similar to using a fish fertilizer on your plants. It doesn't have a complete breakdown of nutrients, so it's going to be very specific. But you can use that water if you wanted to.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to move on to the third section here real quick, because it's going to probably bring up more questions similar to the ones that are being asked, because it's more for so when we're talking about getting each individual plant, there's the low light plants, there's the bright light plants, there's plants that like dry environments, there's plants that like being really not necessarily wet, like they don't want their roots to be wet all the time and sitting in water, but they do like to be moist. So there's a lot of different things to think about when you're picking a plant as far as care goes. So if you have a low light house where you are east facing windows, or just don't have big windows, don't have a lot of light, there are a good amount of plants that you can use that like low and indirect light. One of them would be spider plants, which are really fun. They have little babies, really cute. They fill out relatively quick and grow really fast, even in like medium to low light situations. If you're wanting to put a plant in a bathroom, a snake plant is a really good option because they can survive in low light for years. I have a snake plant that is probably 10 years old and it lives in a very dark corner of my house. So they just grow a lot slower. That's one thing to note, because they can survive in low light, but they don't necessarily thrive. So if you buy a plant at this size and want it to get to 4 feet tall, it might take 10 to 15 years for it to get that tall in a low light environment. Does that make sense? I think that's a good example. Snake plants grow relatively slow anyway. Another one that is okay in some lower light situation are these guys, which are a Ficus variety. They're in the same family as fiddle leaf figs, but they are slightly different in that they have thicker leaves. They're a little bit more tolerant to having more dry soil. They can handle that lower light situation. So those would be good ones. Another one would be a Calathea, which is this little guy. Hard to see. I don't know if you can see it. They've got little stripes on their leaves. They are fun because they rotate towards and away from the sun during different times of day. So those would be really good for lower light to medium light. And then ones that really like bright light are going to be like the bigger leafy ones, like this guy. They like to have a lot more light. They will not grow, they will not put off new leaves if they are in a medium to low light situation. And normally when you get those, you want them to be big and leafy and full. The same goes for like monsteras, which have been a big one that people have been asking about a lot, is Monstera deliciosa. They do need a lot more light. Even the creeping monsteras need some light. So those ones are going to be more of your bright, indirect sunlight, big leafy things. If you're wanting to get those, think about the light needs and what you've got going on in your house, because they do need a lot of light to grow since they are quite a bit bigger and need more energy. And then if your house is more on the dry side, you might have a good environment for succulents. Aloe Vera, this Echeveria that I showed before, they like to be in a little bit more dry environment. Even the spider plants that I showed for the low light can be in that dry environment as well. They actually grow really profusely in the south, and people can put them outside all year long. which is kind of fun. So those are a good one if you have a drier, warmer house inside. A big question after the water needs is plant toxicity for pets and babies. And I do want to say that each plant is different. They all have their own toxicities or safeties. I have a list of an example of toxic plants, but I want to preface it by saying I have almost every single one of these in my house, and I have 3 pets. So it just depends on the pet as well as the plant, which ones you choose as far as toxicity goes. So with plant toxicity, it can be the sap that is toxic. So they take a chomp out of a leaf. It's the sap that comes out of the leaf that causes the toxicity, or it can be the roots. So like some plants, it's just the roots. If you have a pet that digs in your potted plants, that might not be a good option because the sap in the roots is toxic. Another thing I want to point out is that the sap tastes awful. So if they try to take a bite out of it, they're probably not going to take another bite out of it. And there are only a few plants that cause immediate toxicity. A sago palm being one of them. Those ones, if they eat any part of it, can cause a higher toxicity than most other plants. Lilies are another one that are relatively toxic. So if you're worried about anybody grabbing and taking bites out of those 2 would be on the very top to avoid, the sago palm and peace lilies. But some toxicity is low. So say my dog took a bite out of my big leafy philodendron. It's going to cause him to have an upset tummy, and he might throw up that leaf, but that's it. If he took more than 1 bite of it, he'd probably have a little bit more of a reaction. But because it's a low toxicity in the sap, it's just going to make his tummy upset. I hope that kind of clears up the toxicity questions a little bit. It does depend on each plant, so there's a little bit of extra research to go through. We do have a list here of toxic versus non-toxic, and we try to carry both options for people with pets and babies that like to get into things. So we do have that on hand as a reference for people when they come in and look for plants. Another one that I want to talk about really quick before I get into like a little bit longer list is aloe vera, because it is a medicinal plant. Aloe vera can be used topically. Some people also use it internally, depending on where in the world you reside. I have used aloe internally, and it works really well. But the part of aloe that is toxic is when you break off the stem, there's a little bit of green sap on the outside versus the clear on the inside. The green sap is what is toxic, and it causes skin irritation, eye irritation, upset stomach. So if you're planning on using aloe for sunburn, make sure that you blot off the sap part before you use the clear gel-like substance in the middle. Does that make sense? I hope so. And then, okay, so I want to talk about give you some examples of toxic plants. It also depends on, like, if you have pets, where you put your plants makes a huge difference with toxic plants. So one that is toxic is this Dieffenbachia. Most Dieffenbachia species are toxic to animals and people. Another one is this pothos, which is a vining plant. I have 4 of these in my house with my 3 pets, and I just keep them high up and they can't reach them, so I don't have to worry about it. So that's one thing that you can do, is strategically place your plants in places that your pets can't like reach up and take a chunk out of them. Another, I think that's all I have for examples for those, but jade plants are a toxic plant. Most philodendron species, so this big leafy guy, I guess, behind me is a toxic plant. Philodendron vines as well, because there's two different species of philodendrons. There's the upright big green leafy ones, and there's the vining ones. I said sago palms, I talked about lilies. English ivy is another one, but again, that's one that looks really nice up on top of a fridge or up on a shelf, and then your pets don't necessarily get to that unless they're troublemakers like my cat, who likes to get on top of fridges. So there's definitely a longer list, but those are a few examples. Specifically, I wanted to talk about the sago palm and the lilies because those are the most toxic. And they would need probably more immediate action than any of the other toxic plants, if that makes sense. Let me make sure I'm looking at my notes here, make sure that I've talked about everything that I wanted to talk about. Plant toxicity, plants for environments. That is all I have for this last section. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. I want to try to answer as many of those as I can, especially since like environments and house situations make a huge difference in specific houseplant stuff.
Michaela, I think we have a question from, I think it was maybe from the last section on the care, if you don't mind. I heard ground coffee can also be a good plant food in low light situations. Is that true?
Ground coffee has the acidity in it that some plants like. It doesn't have enough, so you'd have to use a lot. So I would recommend, if you, have a plant that needs some fertilization, especially in low light situations, that you go with a liquid fertilizer for those ones, because they'll need it a little bit more than most.
Okay. How about this? What's the hardest plant to kill? Best for brown thumbs?
This one, snake plant, Sansevieria, mother-in-law's tongue of any variety. They are really difficult to kill. I think this one and maybe this guy, this pothos, I pretty much ignore those at home, and they do really well. I have to maybe take a leaf off here and there, but my snake plant is the hardiest because it doesn't need as much water. It grows in the desert. It can be in the low light situations. You can let them dry out completely and then water them. So like my snake plant gets water every couple of weeks instead of every 3 to 4 days. So these guys are really nice, and the leaves are really thick. They're not super pliable. So they're pretty hardy, especially if you have like pets that like to run into your plants or kids that like to touch things. Those ones are really resilient plants.
I don't know how to chat. I apologize for speaking. I don't mean to be rude. I had a question about propagation. Can most plants be put in water and just let them root? Or do you have a specific rule of thumb for that?
Most plants can be put in water. I only use water propagation just because that's the easiest way for me to do it in my house. And so I have a south-facing window where I keep all of my water, my little jars for all of my propagation, and it depends on the specific plant, but most of the time you can do water propagation as long as it has like a root node on it, like these guys. I don't know if my computer is going to focus on this, but they've got little nodes at each leaf section, and you can just cut it off and put those in water and they'll form roots. And I have more success doing it in water for these type of vining things than in soil. Soil takes a little bit more care, and you have to watch it so that the soil doesn't dry out in between.
Michaela, could you list a few more of your favorite plants?
Ooh, yeah. So I talked about the pothos, which was this guy, the vining one. I also have this one at home. This is the Philodendron Hope.
Philodendron Hope?
Yes. And then the Monstera deliciosa, which is in the Philodendron family. Those ones are really fun. I also really love Calatheas, these little guys. They get big depending on the pot that you put them in. And I have one at home that's a pretty good size, and it's just really colorful. Otherwise, most of my other plants don't have very much color. And then I think I have about 6 snake plants. So I really love these guys because they're really easy to take care of. And then let me just do a quick look here to make sure I'm not forgetting anything, because I do like quite a few of them. Let me grab this one real quick, because this one gives you another example of a philodendron, and it's got long, narrow leaves, and it doesn't grow as tall. So these are philodendron narrows, and they are another one of my favorites. I really like those ones a lot. Very fun to grow. And then if you want plants that have more color, that aren't just green, the Dieffenbachias are really fun, like this one that I showed at the beginning, that's kind of white. There's multiple varieties, multiple options with variegation. So like any of the philodendrons, most of the time you can find fun variegated ones. Some of them have pink leaves, which is really cool. So yeah, there's a lot of fun plants. Once you get into the houseplant world, it's really easy to find a bunch that you like.
Do you have a soil recommendation that's best for Calatheas?
Calatheas like well-draining soil with a little bit more peat moss in them. I normally do like a mixture of probably a third potting soil to a third cactus mix to a third peat moss is what I think I have mine in right now. And then I also have it in a draining pot and a big deep dish under it so that I can water it really thoroughly and then dump all that excess water out because it doesn't like to have its roots sitting in water.
What do you recommend for closed terrariums other than succulents?
Ferns are really fun for closed terrariums, especially if you can get them in the little size. Tradescantia are another really fun one. They are a vining plant, but they're little, so they'll just grow around within the terrarium, which is really cool. Moss is another really fun one, especially if you can find different varieties of moss.
Can you please talk about how best to care for ZZ plants?
Ooh, yes, I have
Best light, etc.
ZZ plants can survive in low light situations. They do get a little bit more stretched out in those situations, but they can survive in low light. They do like to have more of that medium range. They don't need super bright light though. So medium light, good draining soil. I believe, at least at my house, I water mine about once a week. And they like to be a little bit more root bound. So before you repot them into a bigger pot, just let them kind of hang out in that pot a little bit longer than you would most other plants.
Okay. Can you, oh yes, thank you. That was just a thank you. Most people say thank you after you answer the question.
Okay. I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. One other thing now that I'm thinking about it though, plants that are really good for air purification. Most plants are going to be good for that. Whatever you pick, all plants do photosynthesis. They all take in carbon dioxide and put out oxygen. Spider plants are a really good, specifically a really good plant for air purification. Most of the big leafy ones are going to be good, like the philodendron and the monstera. Pothos are really good for air purification because they can cover a lot of area because like they will start to vine and they will get really long, and you can just string them around your room, which is really fun. So they cover a lot of distance for air purification. Snake plants are really good because of their larger leaf size. ZZ plants are another really good one, and ferns are another really good one. So for air purification, those guys are good options. But I think that's about all I have, if there's no other questions. If people want to, we are closed for the month of January. I do want to put that out there. We will be open February 1st. But if you have specific houseplant questions, feel free to visit our Facebook page, Starkey's Corner Farm and Garden. And you can send messages to ask questions. You can comment on any of our pictures to ask questions, or you can call us and leave us a message. We're checking our phones periodically this month, but then we'll be back February 1st. And then I do want to mention for everybody that is on this Zoom, we have a coupon for you. So if you want to come in during the month of February, we are doing 10% off of houseplants for you guys for being on this call.
Michaela?
Yes.
I had a question I'd put in the chat. Occasionally my houseplants get little tiny flying gnats.
Ooh, yes. Bugs.
What do I need to do about that?
So depending on, let me first kind of cover broad pest situations. Houseplants are notorious for getting pests. One thing that I really like, especially for the little flying gnats, is a diatomaceous earth on the soil, because most of the time those are fungus gnats and it comes from the soil being too wet. Diatomaceous earth isn't necessarily pretty, but you put it on the surface of the soil and it suffocates the eggs that are in the soil. So I would check also with that how much water you're giving it and if it's sitting in there, because that can tend to lend to having fungus gnats. It is food grade. Yep, diatomaceous earth, kitchen grade. Just make sure it says it on the bag. The ones that we sell here, sorry, my light's getting a little bright now. The ones that we sell here are kitchen grade diatomaceous earth, so you can have it around kids and pets and put it wherever you need to put it. There's also a few different other options for pests, and that would be neem oil, which is a organic compound. Most of the time we sell it in a concentrate and you just mix it with water, and then you spray it topically. Like on this guy, I would spray it on the top of the leaf, the bottom of the leaf, and the stem, just to get it covered. What that does is it coats the plant, so when the bugs take bites out of it, it kills them. Another option, because neem oil does tend to have a little bit of a stronger smell, is insecticidal soap, which works really well. Doesn't have a smell. It does kill bugs on contact. So that's one that is nice if you have especially like big leafy plants that you want to make sure you have covered and they're already having bug problems. Let's see. The only other thing that looks like bugs that's not necessarily bugs is root rot. So if your plants are sitting with their roots in water and the roots start to rot, it shows in the leaves. So it's going to manifest up here versus starting from the soil level. You aren't going to be able to see anything. So that can also look like bugs. So just make sure you're not letting your plants sit in water, because that can make like spots on the leaves and things like that. Does that answer your question? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you. I didn't think of neem oil. I have some.
Neem oil works. Also for fungus gnats, neem seed meal works really well, because you can make a root drench with those by mixing it in and pouring it over the top of the soil.
Have you ever kept a Monstera's aerial roots sit in a cup of water, or let them sit in a cup of water?
I normally just let the aerial roots hang out. I don't normally do anything with them. They are coming out of nodes that are above the soil most of the time. And that happens because they're trying to support themselves. So if your monstera is putting out a bunch of aerial roots, especially if they're not super long yet, those ones might be looking for stuff to grab onto, because technically a monstera deliciosa is a vine. But with the aerial roots that are getting long and you're kind of like wrapping those around, I just leave those the way that they are, because they're taking moisture out of the air. They don't necessarily need to have a water source.
Michaela?
Yes.
Do you know what this plant is? I have it, and it was small when I got it. I have no idea what it is, or if it's an indoor plant at all.
Off the top of my head, I am not 100% sure, but if you want to send us a picture of like a close-up to our Facebook page, just on the Messenger, that could be a way that I could probably determine what it is. Otherwise, if you want to bring it in February, we can look at it in person too.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you repeat? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Can you repeat what you said about the aerial roots on the monstera? What to do with those?
Oh, yeah. So what you can do is you can just let them grow out of the pot if you want, or you can take them and wrap them around the base of the plant and just like let them hang out there. Some of the aerial roots form higher up on the plant, and that's because they're trying to find surface to grab onto, because they're technically a climbing plant. So if your monstera has roots that are coming out higher on the plant, I would get a stake or something for them to hold onto that has either sphagnum moss or peat moss on it, because those roots will start to grow into that and hold it upright a little bit better. Is that kind of what you're wondering?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Do we have any other questions about plant care, about where to put them, that kind of stuff? Soil needs, pot options.
I have one, I think. At what point should you repot? I think it's a Dieffenbachia, like a big, long. It's like super thick and full, but so I don't want to like ruin its environment, but I also don't want it to get too crowded.
I would look at the soil, like look on the soil level under all of the leaves and stuff. Like in this area, if you can see roots up here, like if it's starting to get too root bound, the roots will start forming up on top of the soil.
Okay.
And it'll be really tight in there. Another way that you can do it is like stick your finger into the soil, and if it still like has space for your finger to go into the soil, it's probably okay. But if it's really difficult, then it's probably starting to get a little bit root bound. Another way to know is if you're having to water it a lot, or if it's just not holding on to water and it's draining straight through. That can mean that it's a little bit root bound as well and needs to be in a bigger pot.
And if it's still in its plastic pot, I think I should probably repot it into the, okay.
I would go a size bigger, couple of space to grow into at minimum.
Okay, thanks.
Michaela, I have a variegated rubber plant.
Okay.
And how do you prevent it from having scales?
Ooh, I would put neem oil on it, because my rubber plant does get scale and mealybugs. It's very prone to both of those insects, and I spray neem oil on it. I just have a nice little sprayer, and I spray the stems, the tops of the leaves, and the bottoms of the leaves, because that helps keep them from accumulating on there, and it also gets rid of the eggs and stuff like that.
How much? How often do you do that?
It depends on the severity. So with my plants, I normally spray neem oil on probably all of my houseplants about once every month, just to make sure as a preventative. Because they're not outside, they're not getting rained on, it's not washing off. You don't have to do it super often, but you can do it as often as once a week if you need to.
Mhm. So do you have to wipe it off after that? No.
I would wipe bugs off. I would wipe the bugs off if they look like there's a lot of them. Just kind of get them off of the plant and then spray it with neem. But the neem oil you can spray on there and it'll dry.
They're just like one or two, and then but then it spoils the foliage.
Yes.
And it's beautiful.
So if you see them, I would grab them off of there.
Okay. And another one, how do you prevent soil from getting hard?
That can be underwatering. If you're not watering it often enough, it starts to dry out and then it shrinks in the pot. So if you're letting it dry out too much, it can get really solid. Another thing that could mean is that your plants need to be repotted into new soil.
Nice.
Because the roots can make the soil really hard.
Because what I did was I was just trying to poke them, keep on poking them.
Yeah.
But I noticed, and you were right there, because I noticed that it's kind of a little dry already before I get to water it.
Yes, so it might need to be repotted.
Yeah, I try to water them once a week because I was thinking because of the winter. So it looks like now that I have to water them more often than that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Michaela, I just want to let you know that if you haven't seen the comments there in the chat, that people are very grateful. Thank you so much. Such a great class. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you.
You guys are very welcome. This was really fun.
All right. If we don't have any more questions, I think our time is up now.
Perfect.
Michaela, thank you. And just to remind everybody that Starkey's Corner will be reopening, is it February 1st?
February 1st, yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's just been great to have this program. Fantastic job, Michaela. I learned so much.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.